Hi, and welcome to another edition of Rabbi K's Cuts, visual blasts of wisdom on the weekly Torah portion. I'm joined this week by Jim Henson. Well, sort of. Anyway, this week's Torah portion is Acharemos Kedoshim. It's actually a double parsha. The beginning of the second parsha, Kedoshim, includes one of the most famous lines in the Torah, Kedoshim Tihiyu, you shall be holy. This is a mandate to the Jewish people to act with holiness. The question, of course, is what is holiness? Well, luckily we have some very, very wonderful commentators who come to our aid and give us very interesting interpretations of what the Torah actually means when it uses the word holiness. There are two very famous interpretations of the word holiness, and I will list them both. Rashi, the great medieval commentator, says that to be holy, to be kadosh, means to be separate. Prushim tihiyu, you shall be separate. A very interesting, somewhat enigmatic interpretation. Ramban, Nachmanides, explains it a little bit differently. He states that to be holy means that even in the areas that are permitted to us, even in the areas that the Torah does not forbid, foods that we are permitted to eat, sexual activities in which we're permitted to engage, even in those arenas, we should not overindulge. We should use moderation. Now, I'd like to suggest, perhaps, an interesting link between these two interpretations. Certainly, they are intended as disparate interpretations, but nonetheless, I believe that a certain underlying theme does emerge. I believe that each of these commentaries is telling us that we need to live our lives in a way that preserves our sense of perspective, preserves our sense of focus and mission, prevents us from being distracted and being overwhelmed by the myriad sounds and sights in the world around us. And so Rashi is telling us to be separate. What does it mean to be separate? Well, separateness has multiple connotations, some of which might be negative, but ultimately it depends what we're separating ourselves from and what we're bringing ourselves to. If we're separating ourselves from, let's say, a regular class and bringing ourselves to an honors class, separating ourselves from a lower sports league and bringing ourselves to a higher sports league, separating ourselves from a crowd that's not acting in accordance with our values and bringing ourselves to a crowd that has greater values, then of course separateness in those situations is very laudable. And perhaps the Torah here is telling us, be separate. Separate yourselves from the lower elements of life. Separate yourselves from those distractions in life which lead you astray. And focus and attach yourself to something greater, to something more meaningful. Be separate, be different. Don't be afraid to go against the grain. And Ramban is also telling us that you should not overindulge in those permitted items in life. Because when we overindulge in life, we lose perspective. When we overindulge, we become people that are totally focused on the here and now, totally focused on the artificial parts of life, on the parts of life that might bring us instant physical gratification, but ultimately do not bring us any enduring satisfaction and in any enduring meaning. Ramban is telling us, live a life of meaning. Don't waste life by throwing it away on the ephemeral distractions of overindulgence. And so, this week, let's work on that attribute of holiness that allows us to find perspective, that allows us to separate ourselves from the lower parts of society, from the lower parts of ourselves even, and raise ourselves to a higher plane, a plane of connectedness, a plane of reality. And similarly, let us indulge primarily in pursuits that bring us meaning, that bring us lasting purpose, and not overindulge in those things, albeit permitted, that lead us astray, that completely lock us down and anchor us down into a world that is only obsessed with the here and now. Let's bring ourselves to a world of reality, not a world of artificiality. I think Jim agrees.